Welcome to American History Lesson 18. American Expansion. Our lesson objectives are: identify and understand key factors that spurred America's growth, identify the methods and policy used by American leadership to govern new territories, understand how the American presidency expanded their influence and power worldwide. The road to empire. At the end of the 1800s, the United States joined the global trend to seize lands overseas. The various nations of Europe had taken control of almost all of Africa. Japan was seizing colonies in Asia. The United States began to compete with other nations to gain a trade foothold in China. Three factors pushed the United States to join the grab for land: economic competition for raw materials and markets for its manufactured goods, political and military competition, based in part on the creation of the United States' powerful new navy, a belief in the racial and cultural superiority of the people of England and their descendants, which led many Americans to believe that the United States had a mission to spread civilization and Christianity. Many Americans opposed this imperialistic trend. They objected on both moral and practical grounds, as they felt that taking colonies was not right or would simply cost too much. The first territory acquired was Hawaii, where a number of Americans had established large and successful sugar plantations. Through creating changes in Hawaii's constitution, these planters came to control the government. In 1893, Hawaii's queen tried to change their constitution, and this caused the planters to seize control of the island. President Grover Cleveland refused to annex Hawaii, but his successor, William McKinley, did so. Hawaii became a territory of the United States in 1898. The United States challenge to Spain. The United States has established close business ties to Cuba, which is still a Spanish colony. In 1895, Jose Marti launched a renewed drive for Cuban independence. He hoped to force American intervention, but support of Cuban independence in the United States was divided. Spain sent an army to Cuba, and its commander put 300,000 Cubans in concentration camps while he tried to defeat the Army of Independence. American newspaper reports exaggerated stories of Spanish atrocities against the Cuban people. As more people began to support giving aid to the Cubans, President McKinley tried to find a peaceful solution. Spain moderated its policies and granted limited self-rule to Cuba. The issue of Cuban independence seemed to be dying down. Then two incidents fanned the fire. A newspaper published a Spanish diplomat's criticism of McKinley. Worse, a U.S. warship, the battleship Maine, mysteriously blew up in Havana's harbor. No one knew why or how the explosion occurred, but newspapers blamed Spain, and the cry for war became too strong to resist. The first battle of the war took place in the Philippines, another Spanish possession. Admiral George Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet there, and U.S. Army units joined Filipino rebels. The Spanish in the Philippines surrendered. In Cuba, an ill-prepared American army won an important battle. Press accounts gave great fame to Theodore Roosevelt, who led a volunteer cavalry unit. Within 2 days, a Navy battle resulted in destruction of the Spanish fleet and Spanish surrender in Cuba. Spain quickly agreed to peace that granted Cuba its independence and gave the United States the island of Puerto Rico, Guam, and Philippines. The United States had built an empire. Many Puerto Ricans wanted independence, but others were willing to accept being in American territory. Still others wanted to become a state. The Supreme Court ruled that Puerto Ricans were not American citizens. In 1917, Congress granted a degree of self-rule to Puerto Rico and allowed them to choose their legislature. But Congress still denied statehood to the island. For the first 4 years after the end of the war, the U.S. Army remained in Cuba. The U.S. Army imprisoned Cubans who protested American presence, but it fed the hungry and helped wipe out yellow fever, a fatal disease. The United States insisted that the new Cuban Constitution grant the United States special privileges. Many American businesses had invested heavily in the island, and they wanted their property protected. These provisions were reluctantly agreed to, and Cuba became independent, but partly under U.S. control. The door into China. Filipinos who had been fighting for independence for years were outraged that the United States had annexed their islands. Rebel leader Emilio Aguinaldo led an armed revolt against the Americans. In a war that lasted 3 years, the American army used some of the same tactics that the Spanish had used in Cuba. The revolt was finally suppressed in 1902. The islands finally gained independence in 1946. Imperialists hoped to use the Philippines to gain a foothold in Asia. The main goal was establishing business ties with China. European nations and Japan forced the Chinese to give them valuable trade benefits. Secretary of State John Hay announced the open door policy that opened China to the trade of any nation. This policy increased American presence in Asia. A brief bloody Chinese uprising against Western influence called the Boxer Rebellion was put down by a coalition of Western forces. Fun fact. The Boxer Rebellion was so named because the Chinese soldiers largely came from Aihochuan, a secret Chinese society with a hatred of non-Chinese. They were called the Boxers by American and European leaders due to their method of exercise and martial arts. The Boxers believed their exercises would protect them from Western bullets and military forces. The United States then issued stronger safeguards of equal trade with China. President McKinley supported imperialist expansion and re-election in 1900. Many but not all Americans favored the expansion of American power. As part of the increased American role in world affairs, President Theodore Roosevelt acted as peacemaker to end a war between Japan and Russia. He sent a fleet of Navy ships to sail around the world, showing American naval power. The United States and South and Central America. President Roosevelt's major accomplishment was to ensure the building of the Panama Canal. The canal was to link the American and Pacific Oceans, cutting travel time for merchant ships and for U.S. naval ships. Panama, then a province of Colombia, won its independence in a U.S.-supported revolt. The new nation gave the United States land to build the canal. Construction took 10 years to build the 50-mile-long canal, and it was a success from the start. But Roosevelt's actions caused ill will toward the United States throughout Latin America. The president warned European nations to keep their hands off Latin America. He announced his intention to intervene whenever political turbulence in Latin America threatened U.S. business. President Taft took such steps in 1911, sending troops to Nicaragua. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson took a moral tone in Latin American policy. He said that the United States would refuse to recognize any Latin American government that was oppressive, undemocratic, or opposed U.S. interests. A revolt in Mexico quickly tested this policy. Conservatives, favored by U.S. businesses that invested in Mexico, seized the Mexican government. Wilson used a minor incident to send troops to Veracruz. When a new leader took power in Mexico, Wilson withdrew the troops. Trouble did not end. A revolt against the new Mexican government by Francisco Pancho Villa involved the United States. Wilson sent General John J. Pershing to pursue Villa and punish him for the death of slain Americans. The American soldiers fought with units of the Mexican army, straining relations between the two countries. Finally, the troops were withdrawn. The incident revealed Americans' willingness to assert their power in the Western Hemisphere. What next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation, the author's surname and the date of publication within parentheses, straight after a direct quote. CitationMachine.net will assist you in creating citations.